Welcome to EQUUS Farm Calls, where we take horse owners along with us to discuss important topics on equine health and care with industry experts. Today, we're talking to Dr. Martin Nielsen about equine deworming. The EQUUS Farm Calls podcast is brought to you in 2022 by Farnam. I'm Kim Brown, group publisher of the Equine Health Network. Dr. Nielsen is a professor of equine infectious disease at the University of Kentucky's Gluck Equine Research Center, and he's the associate chair of the Department of Veterinary Science. He's also the director of graduate studies. Dr. Nielsen is the lead author of the AAEP Parasite Control Guidelines, which is available to veterinarians and horse owners online. Originally from Denmark, Dr. Nielsen joined the Gluck Center in 2011. And just to let you know, in the EQUUS article that goes up with this podcast, so you can go to the equusmagazine.com website, I will link not only to this AAEP Parasite Control Guidelines, which really every horse owner should read, but I'll also link to Dr. Nielsen's YouTube channel, where he has got individual YouTube videos, and he's very good at these, on different parasites and deworming and just anything that you would like to know, more than we can get into in just a short podcast. And also I will put a link up to the Gluck Center's Facebook page because there's a lot of great research coming out of the Gluck Center. So good morning, Dr. Nielsen, and welcome.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it. And thank you for the introduction.
Well, just to let our audience know, Dr. Nielsen is a global superstar in the equine parasitology world. He's also a strong proponent of research-based deworming and the study of anthelmintic resistance, which is when the worms aren't killed by current deworming methods and medications. And before we get started, Dr. Nielsen, I know this is an audio, so it's not a video. And so our listeners can't see what I'm seeing, but besides the jar of worms behind your head on your shelf in your window, I see a couple of awards back there. What are those for?
Yeah. I mean, always you always want a jar of worms in your office when you do what I do. But yes, I kind of the videos that you mentioned that I have on my YouTube channel. I was made aware of an equine film festival that actually also goes by the name of EQUUS. It's a little confusing. It has nothing to do with you or the journal or the magazine, but it sort of goes by that same name and has been running for about 10 years. So the director of that heard about some of my efforts and reached out to me and said, "Hey, Dr. Nielsen, will you consider maybe, entering a film?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I just not that kind of stuff that I do, red carpet and anything like that. It's just me doing some silly videos with my phone." And then she said, No, that's perfectly appropriate for this audience, and we do have an educational category. And so I was like, okay, well, why not? And so I submitted 2 years. First year I had a series of videos that I submitted and won the category. I'm not really sure how many other entries there were in that category. I may have been the only one, but it was still a recognition. And then I wasn't really all too happy with those videos. I kind of, did some rookie mistakes in terms of how I decided to format them. So I thought, okay, I have a better idea. And so that's what led to this series that I called the Parasite Journey of the Horse. And it's a series of videos. Each video is about one of the parasites, and I go in the sort of order of appearance, so what parasite do foals get, and as they get older, what other parasites are now coming in and dominating the picture, and what do we know about them, and what are good things to sort of tidbits to take home and maybe think about when you consider parasite control. So that was the next year's entry, and then I won again. So yeah, that was pretty neat. So I'm an award-winning filmmaker for what it's worth.
Well, that's great. And hey, and you won awards on worms. Come on, that has got to be a world-class, world-standing award, because who else could do that, right?
There's nobody stupid enough to try.
So as you all can tell, Dr. Nielsen is not only a wonderful scientist, but he's a fun guy. And before we get to, what he talks about, the modern deworming and the future of deworming, I want you to hear a little bit about his research at the University of Kentucky, because just in the last decade or so, since he's been at the Gluck Center, he's really learned a lot, but he has a unique program there. So tell us a little about your research and your research heard
Yeah, thank you. I was actually tallying up not too long ago. We were asked to sort of do that here at the university. Okay, what have you done, Dr. Nielsen? What have you done for me lately, kind of a deal. And so, and that led me to tally up, okay, how many papers, research papers have we published since I arrived now over 10 years ago, and it's more than 100 papers we published, research papers. And then there's all the additional stuff, all the communications, like the podcasts we're doing today, the videos we just talked about, all the equine horse journal, horse magazine papers, and all that additional stuff. I mean, we've done a lot. And I came to the Gluck Center because of the opportunity to really delve into research, and because of the resources that are available here, the expertise. I just thought it was a unique environment. And one of the major resources and major draws for me was the herds that you just mentioned. So we do have 2 specialty research herds here at the university designated for parasitology research. And they've been here since the 1970s. I mean, they've been here for a long time. They've been maintained, nurtured, taken care of very well by our farm staff. And my predecessors here in this office, Dr. Legendary now, Eugene T. Lyons, and also his compadre, Dr. Hal Drudge, they established these herds and had some ideas. One of these herds is, it's actually a herd of miniature horses, and they harbor multi-drug resistant strongyle parasites. So strongyles are the common type of parasites that all horses get. And it also, those parasites in these miniatures are resistant to 2 out of 3 drug classes, and so multi-drug resistant. And that's very, very common around the world in managed horses, that horses actually have parasites that are multi-drug resistant and commonly resistant to 2 out of 3 drug classes. So now when I think of this herd, I kind of think of it as a mini simulation of a real life scenario, and it allows us to ask a lot of questions about what you can do in the face of already developed resistance with the currently available dewormers, and are there strategies that would work better or worse in terms of double deworming, combination deworming. And we've also we have a big project going on for now several years that is actually looking at a bacterial dewormer. So bacteria that are producing a certain crystal proteins, and some of those proteins that these bacteria make are actually killing worms. So now we're working on trying to get those proteins to sort of pass through the intestinal tract without being degraded before they meet the worms, so they can do their thing against the worm. I launched many years ago, one of the first sort of online things I ever did was to launch a crowdfunding campaign. And you're very aware of this, Kim, because you actually advised me on some of this many, many years ago now. And I named it Let the Germs Get the Worms. And, that's actually still what we're working on here. And we've got some promise. We just published a paper showing that the crude proteins, without any kind of coating or formulation, completely eradicated or eliminated, I should say, the large roundworms from foals that are a major parasite pathogen. And we published that data. Now, what was puzzling was that in the same foals, they also had strongyle parasites, which the parasites I just mentioned all horses have. And so the foals also had those, and the proteins had no efficacy against the strongyles. So we wiped the ascarids, the large roundworms, out, but the strongyles didn't care. They couldn't care less. And so now we're investigating. We know when we do it in the lab in vitro, and you put the worms in a petri dish, add the protein on there, they die, right? And so we know the protein should have the efficacy. So there's something else going on, and we're working to really unravel, okay, what might that be? Is there some kind of coating that we can provide that would protect the protein passing through the stomach acid and then the entire length of the small intestine before it reaches where the strongyles lives, which is actually in the large intestine. So that was one example of some of the work we do. A lot of other things, we've worked a lot on developing and refining a better diagnostic techniques for parasites. I think there's a big push these days for testing rather than just blind treating. Now with all the drug resistance that's around, you can't really be assured that any dewormer will work at all as you think it should without actually testing for it. So that sort of increases the demand for better, easier, more reliable, more precise diagnostic techniques. One of the things we've developed and validated here in the lab, which I actually think is pretty cool, is an automated egg counting system called Parasite, SIGHT, because it takes a picture of the sample after some filtering, adding a stain, and then it's an algorithm. It's actually an app that then analyzes the picture and counts all the eggs that are present on that picture, and then gives you the egg count. And that's developed here. It's now actually a product out there in the domain, and it's been taking off now, also going into other animals. We started out with horses. I'm less involved with the other animals like the ruminants and the cats and the dogs, but I know that the guys that are sort of leading that in the company are focusing a lot on that right now. So that's just another example. And then we do a lot of work with just mapping out the drug resistance and how it's going and how it gets progressively worse. We are looking at the genetics behind resistance to try and understand what are even the genetic mechanisms, the genes that are involved, or genes that are expressed or shut down, and then really just also testing potential new drugs in addition to the protein. We're also involved with other attempts to sort of come up with anything that's new. I think one of the scenarios, one of the sort of things to keep in mind is, we haven't gotten anything new for worm control in horses for the past 40 years. So we have what we have. We have the same classes of dewormers. And, 40 years in, some of those are getting a little old. And we are seeing multi-drug resistance. I mentioned the scenario with the 2 out of 3 classes. Actually, we're now seeing examples of 3 out of 3 classes where so basically nothing works. And that sort of begs the question, what then, right? So those are some of the questions we try to develop and address. And then ultimately it leads to things like the guideline document that you just mentioned, try to sort of distill all of what we do into, okay, this is now what we've now learned, and this is how we approach things now. And that's why we keep updating these guidelines. We do that about every 3 years. So the current AAP guidelines were last updated in 2019, which feels like just like yesterday, but it's already 3 years. So we're going to update them again, actually this year. So.
That's good.
Yep.
And I want to make sure our audience understands. You originally are from Denmark, but you have at the Gluck Center a global collaboration working on equine parasites. Tell us a little about that.
Oh, yeah, that's right. We've got so many collaborators, and it's interesting. The equine parasitology is actually a very, very small field. There's veterinary parasitology, but most people working in veterinary parasitology work with either dogs and cats or production animals, food animals, and primarily sheep, goats, and cattle. And then there's like this niche thing, which is horses there on the side. I think one of the reasons why it's not a bigger field is that there's not that direct source of funding that really you can sort of apply to and get funding from. There's much more funding available for food animal just through things like the USDA, et cetera. So the few that are working in equine, we try to work together and help each other. So the bacterial protein, the germs get the worms project it's a U.S. collaboration, but we're currently three different institutions working together here in the U.S., each sort of bringing our expertise. So I'm the equine guy. We have a sheep gal, and then we have a human parasitologist, a medical parasitologist who's doing the development of the proteins. And so that's a nice team effort, which has really been interesting.
And I just want to say, as a sheep owner, I can tell horse owners, you think we got problems with deworming, you should see those sheep.
Indeed. Yeah. And yeah, the sheep and the goats actually are examples of how bad things can go. There's lots and lots of examples where there's just nothing to treat them with. One of the parasites that are infecting sheep and goats are really, really pathogenic. It's a blood-sucking parasite. So if they get a good number of those, when they can suck out all the blood, and the animals will just sort of die from losing all the blood. And so that's really, really bad. And in many cases, there's really nothing you can do other than maybe call the ones that are worse affected, and then keep the ones that seem to be handling their parasites, because you don't really have. We're
talking about sheep here, not horses, but we're making some comparisons.
Yeah. And in horses, we're sort of getting to the scenario where, there's multi-drug resistance. I think what helps us with the horses is that we don't have a parasite that is as bad as that one in the sheep and in the goats. And I think that's important to keep in mind. I have a lot of conversations with people that go, "Oh, Dr. Nielsen, we have a problem. Can you take a look at these egg counts?" And I see egg counts and I go, okay, you have parasites, or your horses have parasites. So what's the problem? Because it's normal for the horses to have parasites. So, unless you have like health issues, you don't necessarily have a problem. And in most cases, they go, "Oh, no, the horses are doing fine. We're just not comfortable with these egg counts." And then we have a conversation about, okay, it's normal. It's part of the normal fauna of the intestinal tract for horses to have worms, just as normal as it is for them to have bacteria in the gut. And I think sometimes you just need to come to terms with that sort of fact. But no, I have collaborations with people in Scandinavia. We're working a lot with trying to sort of come up with some new diagnostic options. Like there's this whole thing about, we're learning that the worms are releasing little pieces of RNA, which is, again, some nucleic acids, so some of the code, the genetic code. They're releasing that in short little chunks and releasing it into the bloodstream or wherever they are. And then some of these little bits and pieces of genetic code is mimicking or resembling similar pieces that the host, the mammal, in this case, the horse, is making. So what are the worms doing? Are they trying to sort of fool the host, or maybe even affect how the host responds to the parasite? And it's really, really fascinating. And so we're having a project going that is looking at that. And then, of course, maybe some of these little pieces of genetic code that's released by the worms might actually be diagnostic. And so might that be a better way of tracking some of these parasites? So that's one thing we're looking at. One of my grad students is very interested in the large roundworm and the population genetics of that. And so population genetics is where you get a lot of different specimens from different places, and then you look at their genetic code and you see, okay, these worms from over here, how closely are they related to the worms from over here and the worms from over here? And if you get enough samples, you can also estimate the gene flow between populations. Now, that sounds very nerdy, and I admit it is, but it's useful to get to understand these things, because it teaches us how do these worms then spread things like genes for drug resistance. And how do we explain that every time you start identifying a new type of resistance to a new type of drug, and once it's first discovered and people start looking a little bit more, it turns out it's usually everywhere. And so, okay, so it already spread. How on earth did that happen? I mean, we think and suspect that traveling horses, that, global travel with horses and each of them bringing worms to new premises and new facilities is playing a major role. But how exactly does that pan out, I think, is a fundamental question that would help us understand how drug resistance evolves. Another big collaboration that we have is on the bloodworm, which is maybe that one bad parasite that we don't want in the horses. And we don't have it for the most part over here in the States, but in countries where there's been restrictions on use of dewormers imposed and introduced, in some countries, including my own country of origin, Denmark, the drugs are on prescription only basis. Only vets can prescribe them. So they're not used nearly as much there. The dewormers are. And when you don't deworm nearly as much, then all of a sudden that bloodworm can come back. And I actually documented that in Denmark just before I had to leave the country and came here. And so
and that was a joke, by the way, to our listeners. We it's really hard to get Dr. Nielsen to come to the States.
Yeah, so the bloodworm could it be making its way back, especially if we sort of lessen the treatment pressure, the treatment intensity, because we don't want to propagate more resistance, and then we may be able to slow down development of resistance. But then, as a negative side effect, we could risk getting the bloodworm come back. So one of my other grad students is working on mapping out the entire genome of the bloodworm. And again, to fundamentally understand how it behaves, it migrates as the name implies, it goes to the bloodstream. How does it make it, and how does it survive, and how does it complete its life cycle and go back into the intestinal tract? And it does cause some damage while it's doing that. So how's that working out? So that's another project we're working on. I tend to end up helping a lot of people just with study design, people that are in different parts of the world and they want to do a dewormer resistance study, for example, and how do you best approach that with a good study design, the right group size, and the right statistics and things like that. So I help with that as much as I can. A big collaboration I've had for many, many years is with people in New Zealand that are experts on disease modeling. And so what we do there is just to take everything we know biologically about a given parasite, in this case, the small strongyles, and put it into a computer model, a computer simulation. And then have this computer predict how things are going to go under different circumstances. So different treatment protocols, but also different climates, and even with climate change. And so that's been very, very interesting. And what it can tell us is then, all right, okay, are we going to have more parasites or less parasites? And it does take into account the climate, the weather, the rain or precipitation, the host response of the horses. So it matters whether you put a young group of horses or a middle-aged group or maybe some oldies in there, and the output of that model will be different. So it tells us something about, okay, how many parasites will this herd get over the course of 40 years? Well, okay, 40 years is a little bit of an artificial situation because, are we ever going to keep that same herd for 40 years? Well, but in theory, we need that longer time frame to really look at how things are going to pan out. And the other thing, and probably more importantly, that the models can do is look at the development of drug resistance. And what we've been finding there is, okay, not only does how often you deworm matter in terms of how quickly you get drug resistance, obviously that matters a lot. But what also matters is the age of the horses, their immune response to the parasites, and also the climate. Some climates will lead to quicker development of resistance than others, and climate change can also change how quickly and how fast you get drug-resistant parasites. So that's been a big, big collaboration. I was able to actually go to New Zealand kind of just before the pandemic and spend what we call a sabbatical leave. It sounds like I went on vacation, I know, but that's kind of a thing we call it in academia where you take your salary with you, you get approval from your employer, your university to go to another place and then do some work there for a while and then come back and enrich the environment with all the good things you learned. So I had the wonderful opportunity to go there with my family. The kids went to school there. We spent 6 months in the country. I learned to drive the other side of the road for the most part, and did a couple interesting projects. All the computer simulation was one part of it, but we also did a nice field study of horse farms on both islands of New Zealand. So that's been a wonderful collaboration.
Keep your horse happy and healthy and get rewarded with free products at the same time. Farnam Horse Health Products and VitaFlex Pro are proud to celebrate the partnership between you and your horse. So they created the Horse Care Loyalty Rewards Program. It's their way of giving back and provides an opportunity for you to earn complimentary, full-size supplements, fly control, and grooming products that you use regularly. Receive one free product for every 5 purchased at any online or local retail store. View a complete list of eligible products at horsecareloyalty.com. Enroll today and start earning your rewards.
I'm also involved with Australia. So in Australia, they have 4 or maybe is it 5 different climatic zones. So very unique for one country. And so they don't really have any guidelines for parasite control in horses in that country. And they, of course, have been looking at the AAEP ones that are for North America. And we're like, okay, yeah, this may actually work for us, but then maybe it won't because of the climatic zones and also the desert and things that they have a lot of down there. So they, one of the big name parasitologist in Australia got a grant to work on getting more data that would allow them to develop more sort of refined recommendations for Australia, and invited me as sort of the external guy who could be the guy who could maybe advise and bring suggestions. And so that's an ongoing project right now. It's been really fun to be part of. And I'm sure there's a bunch more collaborations that I don't remember right now. I've been helping people in developing countries getting papers written, studies done, papers written and published, because I think it's important to also look at some of these things under very, very different circumstances where it's working equids that don't have maybe the same quality of nutrition available to them, and also very different climatic conditions that definitely changed the whole dynamic of parasite control. So that's been very interesting as well.
Yeah. And so now we're probably going to get into the part of the show where we're going to talk about, what is the modern deworming protocol and management. But I think one of the things that you have made me recognize over the years is there's not a bad class of drugs. It's just how we use the drugs is different maybe from when they were first released. Because I'm old enough to remember when ivermectin first was introduced to the market, and it was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be the end all be all of everything. So there are different ways to use older anthelmintics that still will work, and they're still working against specific species, but we can't just think 1 tube, squirt twice a year, we're good. So we have to think about the worms. We have to be educated as horse owners, and I'm a horse owner. We have to understand fecal egg counts. And I have to say that in some of the locations where I have friends, that the veterinarians are not real high on doing fecal egg counts. So we have to figure out as horse owners how to bring our horses into this modern time. So we're doing the best job that we can. And we need to listen to our vets that are educated in trying to do the best that they can in keeping our horses healthy. So having a few worms in your horse is normal. Let's start there.
Yeah. So first of all, yes, that was a very nice summary. I really appreciate that. I'm sorry that I happened to, before, mention how many years ago ivermectin was introduced, because that sort of might inform your age. But no, a common question I still get very often when I do seminars and webinars is, hey, Dr. Nielsen, what's a good all-round dewormer? And I actually love it when people ask me that question, because I can say, you know what, that doesn't exist. It's not a thing, and you need to get away from that thinking. Yes, originally with the dewormers that we actually still have available to us, they were all sort of developed to be broad spectrum, and one broader than the other. And I think you were spot on with your sort of description of when ivermectin came, because that's been the broadest ever dewormer, because it didn't only treat worms, it also treated certain insects or insect larvae, including the bots that are not worms but are insect larvae. And it was hard for anything to compete with ivermectin, which is one of the reasons, I think, why we haven't seen anything new since then. Yes, there's moxidectin, the Quest products, but that's actually just sort of a cousin to ivermectin. It's just a further development of a little bit of the same mode of action. It belongs in the same family. And so Yeah, so when you take each of the three classes, each of them actually can sort of tell the same story, where it used to have all of these parasites in its spectrum, and we can sort of streak out a few of those for each of the products. And so each of them still work against something, but they don't work against everything. And one of the many challenges we have with that is that the labels, the inserts, or even on the outsides of the packages it will list all the species names, all the parasite names in fancy Latin names that it has label claims against. And it actually gives a false impression, because that's misleading. That's what the world looked like when the product was first approved, which for many of these products is more than 25 years ago. And, a lot of water has run under the bridge since mid-1990s, for example. And what these labels or inserts do not recognize or even acknowledge is, the development of resistance to this product. And you still see advertisements that make the statement that this product is the only product that's labeled against this, that, and the other parasite, which is a true statement, but it doesn't sort of acknowledge the fact that it may be labeled, but it probably doesn't work, right? And so there's unfortunately a lot of misleading information about this out there. And I think when I talk to horse owners and veterinarians, a lot of them sort of say, oh, there's so much conflicting information around about equine parasite control. It's so difficult to navigate and maneuver, and it's hard to sort of figure out what to do. And I say, tongue-in-cheek comment here, but I say, I agree. But what you really need to do is just to do what I say. Then we'll be fine. Tongue-in-cheek, but what I mean there is that I am. I'm unbiased in the sense of my only aim is to just provide the evidence-based recommendations, and I don't have an agenda of selling a particular product. Some of the drug companies actually spread very useful information. Also, they're very capable of it, and they're good at sponsoring events, etc. But there's some bias in there from time to time, and I can cite numerous examples, unfortunate examples. It's just part of the world that we live in. And so, each of the three classes of dewormers, so we have the ivermectin, moxidectin, then we have all of the benzimidazoles. So that's where we have fenbendazole and oxybenzole in this country. I hate to sort of sit here and mention product names, but often that's how people know these. So things like Anthracite and Panacur, for example, belong to that class of benzimidazole dewormers. And then we have all of the Pyrantel products, and that's where you have the strongyte type products. Those are the three classes, and each of them still work well against at least some parasites, but they don't work against all of the parasites on the label. And just this morning, I think I'm helping out with one of the big Facebook groups called Horse Vet Corner, and where horse owners can ask questions and veterinarians answer. And I'm one of the vets answering, and I sort of just check every morning. I check if there's anything about worms. And this morning there was a question about, it said something along the lines of, with all the different dewormers available, which one do you recommend? And, you could probably predict what I said. Well, I said, you're not, there's a part missing from your question here. And let me help you. I said, with all of the different worms that horses can get, what should we recommend? And point being here, you need to test, right? And you need to find out, best example is in a young horse that might also both have the strongyles type parasites and the ascarid or large roundworm type parasites that you might see in a weanling, in a short yearling. You need to know whether only one of those is present or both, because that will affect your choice. There is really unlikely to be any dewormers that would effectively treat both anymore. That's just how the resistance has developed. So typically the drugs that work well against the ascarids tend to not work at all against strongyles, and vice versa. But the good news is that we probably still have, for the most part, one that would treat at least each of these two. So there could be a situation where we need to treat with one type of drug or the other type of dewormer, or sometimes even both, depending on the test result. And so that's an example of where you need to know what you're treating, and not all worms are the same. Also, one kind of parasite I get a lot of questions about is the pinworm. Pinworms, because I think they're visible. I think they're very common, and you can see them in horses of all ages. Most of the time, they don't really cause much harm, but it does cause the itching and the tail rubbing. And the type of question where a horse owner sees some worms in the poop of their horse, and they take a picture, and they either send it to the veterinarian, which I'm sure happens a lot, or they put it on places like Horse Vet Corner and go, which worm is this, and how do I get rid of it, right? And so it's another parasite that has a different resistance profile and different sort of considerations to be had. I do have a video about pinworms on my YouTube channel, just full disclosure, so you can learn more about that there. So that's one part that you need information about. Now, the pinworms, you can't really detect them with egg count, so there's a different technique for that, and I won't get into the details, but there is a test for pinworms as well. But the other, just as important part, before we can really answer that question of, hey, what should I deworm with, is to find out what the levels of resistance are in your herd, or the herd that your horse lives in. And again, there is a test for that, and we call it the fecal egg count reduction test, where you look at the percent reduction following deworming in preferably a group of horses. And that's the one thing I'm pushing all that I can, that, that's where things should really start today. When you're like, okay, what should I test for? Well, first and foremost, you need to test what you're doing, the dewormers that you are using, to see if they even work, and then go from there. And I still don't see a lot of people doing that. They're like, they may be considering some egg counts to find out, if their horses have worms. And I'm like, no, your horses have worms. That's not the question to ask. It's more, what works and what types of worms we're finding. And so again, I do have a video on that, and really trying to get these messages out. And so, yeah, as you said, Kim, the good news is that there still appears to be a place for each type of product that we have, even though some of them are very, very old. But time is running out, and we have, in the last couple of years, published evidence of lots of ivermectin and moxidectin resistance in strongyles parasites, which was sort of the last standing, still effective class of dewormer, and now we're losing that. And I'm actually just this morning finalizing yet another paper on that. And yeah, we've been talking about it. We've been maybe even crying wolf about this a little bit for too long. Like, oh, it's just around the corner. It's just about to happen. And it's drug resistance in parasites is very slow to develop, much slower than you see with bacteria and antibiotics, for example. It's very, very slow. But once it's there, it never goes away, and there's no turning back. And unfortunately, it looks like, at least here in central Kentucky, we've hit that point, and we're actually sort of battling with triple drug resistance on some of the farms around here, in pretty high-end fancy farms with fancy and great-looking yearlings, but they have multi-triple drug resistant parasites. We also, with that collaboration in Australia that I just mentioned, we've also demonstrated moxidectin resistance there. And so it's coming, it's here. And so we do need alternatives. And we've been looking at the pharmaceutical industry for a long time, and they're very secretive. So we don't know if they're doing anything. But certainly we could really need something from the pharmaceutical industry, something new. Should we ever get that, something new with a new mode of action and no resistance developed to it, I think the big job for people like me is to make sure that we're not going to repeat all the mistakes from the past with carpet bombing and deworming monthly or every 6 weeks or every something crazy like that. It's going to be a hard and tough battle, but I think we need to just get all the advice and recommendations out there whenever we we get our hands of a new dewormer.
I want to make sure our audience understands, because I'm a horse owner. And this is one reason we did this EQUUS Farm Calls, is because I get to talk to Dr. Nielsen. He actually will answer my calls, whereas it's a little harder for everybody to try and get the answer from the experts. So I want to make sure that you understand that there are ways to deworm effectively. But it goes back to just what we do with everything else with our horses. Every horse is an individual, and we have to figure out what that horse needs. I'm not going to give my mare with PSSM type 1 bushel of grain. I'm not going to let her out on green grass. I'm not going to give the miniature donkey that I have, who is an air fern, the same feed or care that I'm going to give a thoroughbred that's off the track, that the reason it has performed so well being in Kentucky is because the grasses in Kentucky were meant to raise beef cattle and put fat on them. So those hard keepers do real well. So we need to think as horse owners about deworming as an individual horse first. Then once we figure out, as Dr. Nielsen has lectured me on over the years, is that once we figure out which one of our horses are the biggest shedders and what our resistance levels are, then we work with the experts to say, okay, well, in this horse, my older quarter horse gelding, who's been around forever and was back in the day where, he got a dewormer stuck up his mouth, every, 3 months, whether he needed it or not, because we didn't know if he needed it. He may have a little bit of problem with the resistance. So we may have to go a different route of combining this drug and this drug, and understanding what we're doing for that horse. Whereas the young horse, as Dr. Nielsen just said, gosh, if he's got pinworms as well as ascarids, that may be, again, 2 different products that we need to use. It's not a one and done anymore. So as horse owners, I think we've turned the corner on deworming to where we're responsible for individual management of our horses. And once we understand those, we can manage them better as a herd. Now, have I summarized what you have left?
Yes, I think that was an excellent summary. Really appreciate it, and actually love listening to it. I think one thing I would add is, yes, maybe one way to summarize what you just said is that the assumption that, if one horse has worms, they all have worms, is sort of true to some extent. Yes, they all have worms, but they don't have the same. And there's plenty of examples of, with some of the parasites, for example, tapeworms. That's another one that we need to think about when we consider how to control parasites. So the tapeworms, you can have horses grazing side by side. One has tapeworms, the other one doesn't. It's just the way it is. And so these general assumptions that, okay, this horse had worms. I saw worms in the poop. I want to deworm them all because now they probably all have worms. Yes, they all have worms, but they may not all need the same treatment. And it's, again, normal for them to have some worms. So it actually is beneficial for them to have some worms. And so yes, we need to individualize our approach and sort of have that granularity in how we approach parasite control. But at the same time, Kim, still keep in mind that it's a parasite population that we're handling here, and that's shared by all the horses. And so if we only deworm our own horse, and if we don't know what's happening to all the other horses in that herd and have no idea what they're deworming with, if they even are deworming, are they deworming at the same time, or are they deworming inappropriately? If we don't have that sort of coordination, we don't really have a strategy. And that sometimes is the big challenge when you have like a boarding stable where each horse owner owns 1 or 2 horses, and they kind of tend to use their own veterinarian. And some boarding stables have done a great job saying, if you board your horse here, we have this one veterinarian who coordinates the parasite control program and does the testing and makes sure that we all follow sort of the same general principles here. But others sort of struggle with that. But I do recommend going in that direction, of course. I think, and I do have some great examples of it actually working out really well. But because so parasite control is sort of a population approach. And you may only own 1 or 2 horses out of that population. The needs between the different horses is likely to be different, but you still need to sort of have it coordinated. So it's sort of a little bit of both. You don't need to treat all the horses alike, but you need to have what you do coordinated for that population.
Right.
That's not easy. always.
No, it's not. It is not. And it's not easy if you're taking your horses on trail rides to shows and you think, oh, I'm going to get my horse out and let it graze a little bit. Or you've got the paddocks when you go to a trailhead and everybody grazes the horses in the little fields near the streams. You're going to pick up some parasites that don't live at your house.
Yeah. Yes, you are. Not very many, though. I mean, if they're only grazing for like a half hour or something like that, it's limited how many they'll pick up. And also, you tend to find the same worms everywhere anyway. It's not like you have, oh, we only have these species over here on this farm, and the next farm we have different species. I mean, one famous parasitologist once said, to kind of paraphrase a little bit, but I think he said, I think of North America as one great pasture shared by all the animals. And that's pretty much it. Maybe especially with the horses because of the moving and traveling and all. And so we tend to find the same species regardless of the climate, not just within the United States, but between different countries. We also tend to find the same types of resistance to the different drugs, although there are some differences, at least when it's first sort of popping its head up. I think when I said the 2 out of 3 drug classes scenario, so those 2 drug classes are the benzimidazoles and the pyrantyl products, you tend to find that everywhere in the world in strongyle parasites. Now, where we might see some differences, at least for now, is regarding the resistance to the last class, the ivermectin moxidectin class, and that's where I said we're beginning to see it here. It's always been also been described in Australia, and I think now it's a matter of people starting to look in other places of the world, and they'll probably find that there as well. But it's still sort of spreading, and I think at least for a few years we'll see that, it's not something you find uniformly everywhere. There might be farms where there's no signs of resistance and farms with signs of resistance, and then we'll sort of be able to track that and see that spread.
Okay, so
yeah. Anyway,
let's wrap up with a bullet point summary for horse owners, people like me, on deworming. What do I need to be doing to do this right?
You need to first and foremost test what you're doing. So you may have a program, a protocol where I usually deworm with this product at this point of time. I may actually be doing egg counts because I heard some guy with a weird Danish accent say something about that at one point, or somebody else. So you may have a program in place already, but what I say is test the efficacy. So you need to follow up with egg counts about 2 weeks after deworming and compare. So to see if you got that reduction. There really shouldn't be anything 2 weeks after deworming, or it should be very low counts depending on how high they were before. So really that's where you need to start. You need to test the dewormers that you are using that may have been recommended to you, or maybe you've been using them for a while because you felt like they worked well. You don't really know that. So that's where you need to start. And once you may be finding that some of those don't work, that's where you need to talk to your veterinarian or find a veterinarian with particular keen interest in these things. I mean, veterinarians each have their specialties, and some tend to focus on, I've heard sometime that there are other things in the world of veterinary medicine, besides the worms. I've heard about that. I mean, obviously nothing as important, but I mean, there are other areas of specialty where people tend to maybe not really say, well, worms is not my thing, but other vets do, right? So you need to find those vets that can advise you on what to do and maybe adjust your protocols. So really simply put, that's kind of what you need to do. And then you can discuss with your vet, okay, what are the appropriate times of year? Consider the age range of my horses. Do you have only adults? Do you have geriatrics? Do you have young stock? Do you have foals and yearlings and 2-year-olds? I mean, the recommendations will change depending on what age groups you have. I want to say the easiest age group to handle parasite control-wise is the middle-aged adults. Let's say 5 or 6 up to 15, maybe a little bit older than that, years of age, right there in the middle. That's where you can be the most laid back. Yes, they'll have some tapeworms that you need to think about. They will have small strongyles, but they usually are not affected by them at all. And then you might run into some questions surrounding the pinworms we talked about, maybe bots. But for the most part, they're doing well with their worms and not really having many issues. And once you get into really old horses and they have maybe some of the metabolic issues that older horses can get, then you might actually need to pay a little bit extra attention there, additional testing, consider maybe additional treatments. And again, with the young horses, that's where you have the highest risk of parasitic disease. However, I want to say parasitic disease is extremely rare in horses and is really the exception rather than the rule. So once you have the first question addressed, which is what works. Then there's all these additional things to consider to maybe tailor the parasite control program better to your horses. And if you board your horse at a boarding stable, which many of your listeners probably do, have a conversation with the owner, with the other boarders, and maybe thinking about a little bit, simply put, can we coordinate a little bit what we do? Maybe just have everyone to agree on testing the dewormer efficacy and start there. I think sometimes you need to you need an eye opener, and it might be an eye opener to show that, hey, it isn't working. And what can we do instead?
Well, thank you, Dr. Nielsen. I know this has been a little longer than most of our podcasts, but
that's how it always goes with me.
Well, and I love this topic because it's something that horse owners we can take the lead on this. We can take charge of our horses and do a better job for them and for ourselves and for the future horses. So thank you, Dr. Nielsen, for being on the EQUUS Farm Calls podcast today.
My pleasure.
And we again will do links on EQUUS Magazine's website for this podcast. The article will have links out to Dr. Nielsen's videos and some of the other things that he has to offer. And we'll link out to the AAP parasite guidelines. And thank you to our listeners for joining us on this podcast, which is new in 2022. So I welcome your input and hope you'll tell your friends about it. And if you have suggestions or comments, just contact me at kbrown, that's the letter K Brown, at equinenetwork.com. EQUUS Farm Calls is a production of the Equine Podcast Network, an entity of the Equine Network, LLC.